So this paper is a joint attempt by a British archaeologist and a Russian historian to create a new, it's not the joint attempt, it's the first step of the joint attempt to create a new vision of late Iron Age Britain and particularly Kent in the time of Caesar. First of all, first of all, my big thanks to organizers for such a great and very interesting workshop. It's amazing. And it's an honor for me, and I'm sure for Jake as well, to present here our paper. Go to disclaimers. First of all, it is I who are fully responsible for the title. Yesterday, Jake asked me if we're too rude with Caesar, with calling him a liar. So honestly, I have to say that Jake is very polite, and I'm a rude boy, and I'm a barbarian from North, so I don't care. I can call him so. So we'll be talking like Caesar, liar, liar, togas on fire, but still we're going to criticize him at least a bit. So about the paper itself. It is not the paper that provides final answers. It is one that raises some questions and challenges the dominating narrative of Southeast Britain in time of of Caesar. The narrative, which is built mostly on the words of Caesar, who had had a couple of rather short encounters with Britons in 55 and 54 BC. As we try to show in this paper, it's necessary to go through and beyond this widely accepted grand narrative because it's biased and it's sometimes misleading and sometimes it seems just to be wrong. So let's begin. Why Gramsci? It's a natural question because, Antonio Gramsci is a great communist and a great philosopher, but he's not a really outstanding scholar of Roman Britain and pre-Roman Britain. So why Gramsci? Here, there are two passages, you can see two passages that I asked Jake and myself to write down before we started working on this paper, just to explain to ourselves why we decided to look at Gramsci. But long story short, it all started 2 years ago at a small local pub in Canterbury when we started discussing the fate of Roman Canterbury, and this fate can be called as subaltern fate of a Roman town, Romano-British town. So I don't know, and I can't quite really well remember when Gramsci first appeared. There were a couple of pints. But Jake is an honest labor man, and I'm a communist. So Gramsci should appear in our discussion. So somehow, strangely, it led us to discussing things right now, right here. Thank you for this again. So let's talk about Caesar and his words. There is a recurrent statement among the scholars that Caesar's narrative on Gallic wars should be read very carefully. This is not an objective and honest report on events. It expresses both authors' ambitions, prejudice, and Roman cultural stereotypes. Its content is determined by the current Roman political situation. And we should always remember that we deal with what Rimbaud called deformed history. So, at its best, this narrative of Caesar gives us a rather specific perspective on the Roman expansion in Britain. And it is perspective of the conqueror and the exploiter. It is a story delivered by a person keen to praise himself and quite arrogant about the others. It's not even one side of the story. It's more like one person's side of the story. You can see two quotes from the recent volume edited by Hasselgrove and Fitzpatrick about archaeological investigation of Gallic wars and Caesar account. You can see that they provide us with balanced agenda to deal with Caesar, which is really, really well founded. I would like to stress out three features of Caesar's narrative on Britain and British expeditions, just to make a general impression of his narrative and its distortion. First of all, Caesar, it's a special and ethnic or ethnocultural feature. Caesar tends to rearrange the space he conquers and the people he deals with. So he rearranges the space of Gaul. We can remember the first line of Gallic War, where he divides into the regions. He does the same trick, though, like not that directly, by with Britain, when he says there are more civilized people who lived at a maritime region called Canton, and there are inland Britons who are not those civilized. So the spatial rearrangement goes hand to hand with ethnic labeling. Caesar provides his readers with tribal names, short descriptions that are designed to distinct more civilized from less civilized, warrior-like enemies from peaceful friends. And there is no indication that Caesar's words reflect the complex reality of ethnic, social, territorial, and political life of Britain, Gaul, or Germany at the time. Then the second feature is about society. We can see British society through some remarks of Caesar, and its society could be communities can be divided into two big groups. The first one is kings, chieftains, nobles. This is the elite. They represent British tribes when they contact with Caesar. They act and command, and Caesar can negotiate with them. And they can be hostages. The hostages that will have some Roman stuff, Roman goods, and who will then later can go back to their tribes and rule over them. And there are Britons overall in general, or sometimes called multitudo. It's the mass of the people. They fought, they killed, they work, they enslaved and robbed. They're doomed to provide Romans and Caesar with booty. So, and this group is subaltern. And next, one more feature, kind of note on the like kind of marginalia about Caesar and Caesarism in British narrative. Caesar, and I think it's applicable for like the whole Gallic War. Caesar represents himself as Caesar from Gramsci work Caesarism. He's a great personality entrusted with task of arbitration. You can see here like short summary of the case of Cassivellaunus and Mandubracius, two noble Britons. Cassivellaunus killed the father of Mandubracius, took his power. Mandubracius fled to Caesar. Caesar was asked by Trinovantes to bring back Mandubracius to power, and he helped them. And overall, from the perspective of Caesar, this case couldn't be solved without his intervention. So these kind of key features which form foundation of present, not only Caesarian narrative, but present narrative on British expeditions of Caesar. And they form this what we can call historiographical and cultural hegemony of Caesar. And this hegemony can be seen in modern monuments everywhere, or not its Caesar figure itself, but his influence. You can see here two monuments from different countries and from different times. To the left is a war marble plaque which commemorates the probable place of landing of Julius Caesar in Britain. Walmer has nothing to show to the tourists and nothing to be proud of except for brewery, but it was closed 50 years ago. So only this spot with Caesar is everything they can show to the people and to themselves to connect with a great history. So hegemony is used to justify our presence here. And the second monument to the right is a monument to Alexei Yermolov, Russian general of 19th century. It was demolished in 1989. It's centered in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. And General Yermolov was a hero of Napoleonic Wars who later conquered Caucasus. He was a great admirer of Caesar. He read Caesar and he tried to represent himself as a Caesar. So when he's remembered as a great general by one and by a war criminal by others, and he did to Chechen, Ingush, and other people exactly the same Caesar did to Gauls and Britons. So this monument commemorates Yermolov, but it also commemorates a Russian general who tried to act like Caesar and who admired Caesar. This is very interesting, and it shows that one can think that that these things I mentioned, this Caesar hegemony is well known and is reflected in Romano-British studies, but it's not. Romano-British studies follow footsteps of Caesar, follows his narratives, and that is a big problem. You can see here on the sorry. On the slide, you can see frequently asked questions which not criticize Caesar, but that follow him and just try to correct a bit. You can see that events that are popular in narratives and research, and you can see rarely mentioned details like pillage and plundering, the strategy and tactics of scorched earth, killed Britons, and the most painful thing for me is that question almost never asked is the question: how accurate is the description of British expeditions and Britons and Britain in Gallic War? And is there any possibility for alternative story of Iron Age Southeast Britain? So this is the moment when Jake enters as an archaeologist in a most dramatic manner. Thank you very much.
Where I'm picking up from what Anton was talking about is the ongoing hegemony, as I see it, that is actually written into the academic study of Roman Britain, of late Iron Age Britain, or later pre-Roman Iron Age, as the language puts it, or has put it. And what I'm trying to say, first of all and overall, is that these usual markers, it's like a kind of a culture history approach that still largely applies, except that it's being picked away at by particular studies. This late Iron Age culture, which was called in the Aylesford Swalling culture, named after type sites, which we'll come back to. There are typical traits of this, but the thing is, they're applied very. Sorry, I'll just go back to this. They're applied still in a very generalized way, and it still plays into the post-Caesar way of depicting this culture. So these ways of looking for the so-called Aylesford Swalling late Iron Age culture in southeast England are to do with coin use, particularly wheel-thrown, grog-tempered pottery, as opposed to the preceding, more localized fillers that were used in pottery, including these pedestal urns, which are a general Gallo-Roman type, as well as imports from the Gallo-Roman contexts like butt beakers and Gallo-Belgic platters and so on. The Latin art style, again particularly on deposited metalwork and other materials, is another defining characteristic. And the idea that everyone took on the cremation funeral, which again was a Gallo-Belgic or Gallo-Roman existing culture. And that's the emphasis. So, for example, if we look at coinage, these are you see the coin using tribes in late Iron Age Britain image on the left there. But all of those tribes and those coinage zones, etc., are actually based on post-Caesar situation. And the Cantiarchy is a name that really only comes about in the early 2nd century, when Canterbury, the Roman town of Canterbury, is called Dura Vernum Cantiarchorum. And that's really the first time that town takes any kind of seems to take on an administrative use. It had some other use or some other function before that. And let's call them the Cantiarchy. No, let's call them the Cantii, are actually brought together by history into this group in the same way Caesar does. And the coinage talked about, so those associated with Commius, perhaps, probably, those Tincomarus and Cunobellinus, these represent these people that made good out of Caesar's visit, yeah? So the Trinovantes, Atrobates, etc. They represent, I think, a new hegemony in southeast England. Well, very clearly from the evidence, that's what they do. There's a new hegemony, and there's actually evidence of what you might call evidence coming out of a previous hegemony, which is much more centered on the Kent area. In other words, there's evidence of, but we'll come back to that. There's some, during the latest Iron Age, after Caesar, this Cantiarchy area, Cantii area, first of all, only had this in uninscribed coin series from about 40 BCE. And eventually they started getting some coins like the other areas that were dominant, particularly named after Dubnu Vilornus. And look how Roman styled this coin is. And Dubnu Vilornus himself is associated with other centers of power, and I think he's probably just a plant in the Canterbury or Kent area of those other hegemonies. So that's what that is. So moving on, there's some of that some of that late Iron Age grog-tempered pottery, and there's some of the typical imports and copies of imports. Okay. From North Gaul and the Rhineland. And here's what we have. It's not really it's been called an oppidum after Caesar, or a territorial oppidum at Canterbury, but it's actually by far much smaller and less significant looking than those in those areas to the north of the Thames and to the west of Canterbury, to Sussex, which in the later Roman period, in the later Iron Age period, had a hegemony. But again, all of this stuff, and there's the small ditch at Canterbury compared with an enormous set of ditches and banks in other places like Colchester or Gosbecks in particular, and at Chichester. So what have we got going on in Kent before Caesar? And this is where this series of material culture comes in. The flat linear Potin coins. Now, these coins, and there are examples of them in late Iron Age Gaul as well, in other groups there. These are actually, they're not struck coinage, but they're cast coin made out of a high tin content copper alloy. And they have these very typical Celtic designs on them as well. And recent work by David Holman, who's a Dover archaeologist, East Kent archaeologist, has demonstrated a suggested date range for these. And just have a look at those dates. They come down to the Caesar episode. Now these coins circulate well after Caesar as well, when they're turning up in hordes and in deposition contexts, often ritualized votive contexts in the latest Iron Age and into the Roman period too. But the idea is that they were first circulating perhaps as some sort of monetary economy in the time before Caesar, i.e. the people that Caesar met. And here's just run through of the dating of those and distribution of those quickly. So 125 to 100 BCE, 100 to 80 BCE. You can see the focus, and there's some outliers in other parts of the southeast and further north. And then 80 to 55 BC, looking very interesting there, with lots of more deposition in these parts, which come to be the more powerful after the Caesar episode. And Mandibrachius, by the way, comes from this area, around about here. And the latest, which crosses over the flat linear Potins group G, which you can see again, there's this very heavy concentration, but also much more going on in this area, which becomes more powerful after the Caesarian episode. Now, these people, this is all pre-Caesar as well, but they're the same. These are often associated with people north of the Thames because of the ongoing hegemony, but they were found in the Thames. This is the Waterloo helmet and the Battersea shields, which are held up as, that is particularly held up as one of the great bits of late Iron Age artwork from Britain, which understandably, the point is they are from the Thames and they are pre-Caesar. So they could just as easily belong to or have been deposited there by people south of the river, or let's say based on the river, rather than it being leaning towards those that became powerful after Caesar. And here's one of the early people in that, what if we call it a pre-Caesarian hegemony. This guy, grave 112 from Deal, which is just along the road from Walmer. And you'll notice the, I think, rather folky Latin design on his headdress as well. He's dated to about 200 BC. But my point is here that local inhumation traditions continued, and this is coming to light much more in developer-funded archaeology, where we're not just focusing on cremation burials because that's what we think we're going to find. Actually, inhumation burials sporadically to small groups, family groups, continued all the way through. So this is from Brisley Farm near Ashford, which is in East Kent near Canterbury. Notice there's a butt beaker in there as well. This is really at the latest Iron Age, and possibly even just into the Roman period in Britain, where they're burying people they think of as significant, with these Gallo-Belgic imports, but at the same time using inhumation. So the cremation thing, trait of the culture, breaks down at these lower levels as well. Something else to point out here, this is the Bridge burial. This was a cremation burial. Bridges, again, near Canterbury. It's dated to just around about the time of Caesar, this burial. And all sorts of interest in there. Notice the brooch, which we'll come back to in a minute. But what I want to point to is this design that emerged on it when it's being cleaned, which is which is not in the least bit Latin. If anything, it looks more Hallstatt, but even that would be pushing it. And I think these are local forms of art that don't even necessarily fit with or it could be from another part of Gaul or whatever, but even then it's not in the least bit Latin. Incidentally, notice this here, moving on to the next slide, this burial again from Chilham near Canterbury. Notice the very, I would call it very folky, almost scrimshaw quality of the Latin design on this mirror, and something to pick up on in these late Iron Age contexts. It's not all just as I think they're already different layers of hegemony, different types of subalterns within this, let's say, this potent coinage material culture that we were talking about. Now, the other thing to point out here is the problem. This starts with the problems of dating, okay? The problems of these, this is the brooch from the Bridge burial, and these brooches here, the brooch from the Bridge burial is dated by some people 90 to 50 BC, which would put it into our pre-Caesar culture, but it's dated by others 75 to 25. And again, these boss on bow type brooches from Chilham, they're dated from 70 to 50 in the report, but other writers writing today will put the boss on bow types later. So there's a real problem of chronology going on here to try and find these actual people. How am I doing for time? Okay, so quickly, just looking at this is the Aylesford, one of the Aylesford burials that gave its name to the Aylesford Swaddling culture. This is after Caesar, probably just after. Again, I think that this style of Latin is not really a patch on the Battersea shield, for example, although perhaps a bit nearer the Waterloo helmet. And then there's a patera and a piche or a ewer in there as well, which are Roman imports. At Canterbury, we've got a late Iron Age burial that has got a bronze vessel, which is dated by Tim Champion to pre-Caesar times. But of course, these things could easily be buried after. They could be kept in circulation for a long time before they're buried. Thing to notice here quickly, and I'm coming to the end of my section now, is this type of pottery. These are the classic pedestal urns that we get in this gallo belt in this late Iron Age pottery, uh, which I want to talk about quickly here. Tim Champion, who I've been talking to about this as well, he's even wondered if these grog-tempered versions of these are actually purely funereal in design. In other words, they're selected because of some quality they have in life to be put in, that they're right for burials. Because going back, Isabel Thompson was looking at this and largely defined this late Iron Age so-called Belgic pottery, because they again, the pottery specialists in the past were taking their cue from Caesar, who said there had been a Belgic invasion. So they called this Belgic pottery. But Thompson pointed out that some of these pots were made in the local fabrics, or rather so they weren't grog tempered. They had other types of filler. Okay. And you'll notice that there's some interesting zones here of that. And I think this zone here with the shell ties in rather well with the more, let's say, the what ends up being the more powerful and dominant after Caesar, whereas these central and eastern Kent is where we're finding some of those things that look much more like they're subaltern to Caesar. One thing I would need to mention quickly is that I think this monetary economy of the Potins, the best contender for it is for why it's there is this area here, the Weald of Kent, which is rich in iron resources. We even have some uh, carbon 14 data, which puts extraction of that material way back before Caesar as well. So that might be what that hegemony is based on. So these questions arise, I think, for this particular um, zone of late Republican influence. For one thing, can we isolate and understand the pre-Caesarian culture in its complexity and data, and thereby gauge the effects on it of Caesar's intervention? If so, can we start to hear another voice in the narrative of late first century Southeast England, and in the area of latter-day Kent in particular? This Gramscian theory of hegemony and subaltern can be directly applied to this archaeology, and it helps to have a solid theoretical underpinning where we're looking for types of a hegemony and hegemony that takes over from other hegemonies and so forth in the archaeological record. So we can see the changes brought about by various agencies, including Caesar. And the point that I've been thinking about today, which I just patched in at the end, having listened to some of the excellent papers before, it's interesting that we should draw a distinction between the balance of evidence types in our case study. In our case study, Caesar is pretty much the hegemony of all subsequent study, because the written word is powerfully hegemonic in historical societies, okay? And it has been to the archaeologists that have studied this period as well. There are other echelons of subalterns that only archaeology can tell us about, as long as we don't let hegemonic historical sources rule the research agenda, and we could call these prehistoric subalterns. And then I'm going to give you the last slide, which our more vigorous Russian colleague provided, which is Caesar getting stabbed in the back. Thank you very much.